10 years of pretending to be dumb to avoid forced marriage shattered in 3 seconds when she blurted, "You mean the Queen's sacrifice at a charity auction?" And the billionaire smiled because he'd finally caught the genius who'd been hiding in plain sight. Carolyn Hatcher had survived by convincing the world she was too simple to exploit, fumbling champagne glasses while memorizing every power play in the room, playing her father's embarrassment while running CL Hatch, the anonymous strategist whose analyses had reshaped 3 continents of boardrooms, including Brian Dame's own company. But the moment she corrected his deliberately wrong chess terminology in front of 200 witnesses, when he traced her intellectual signature through Latin poetry watermarks hidden in reports he'd paid her consulting alter ego for, when her father discovered her double life and retaliated by fabricating psychiatric records to prove she was mentally unstable, leaking them to destroy her credibility and frame her as a delusional manipulator who'd seduced Brian to steal his empire, Carolyn faced the reckoning she'd spent a decade avoiding: expose her father's money laundering and fraud while revealing she'd been pretending all along, or disappear and let the mask that saved her become the lie that destroyed her, while the one man who saw her truth waited at a bus terminal with evidence that could either vindicate her or prove he'd been playing a game even more dangerous than hers. Hello, my dearest family. You mean the world to me. Your love keeps me smiling and strong every day. May the heavens cover you with favor and peace. May love find you in every sunrise and joy follow you in every sunset. You are loved beyond measure. Thank you for your endless support. Our bond can't be broken. Comment where you're watching from, and let's make this video shine to the suitors. She was pretty but vacant. To the board members, she was poor Charles's burden. And to her father, she was disposable until she became profitable. Carolyn had never meant to catch the attention of Brian Dames, not when she was nothing more than the girl who fumbled with champagne glasses and forgot her own father's speeches. But brilliance, like fire, cannot stay hidden forever. In her mind, that stubborn, ruthless thing she'd buried for a decade had decided that if anyone was going to see through her disguise, it would be the one man who could destroy her for it. He never looked at her with pity, and that was what terrified her, because Caroline wasn't just a disappointing daughter playing dumb at dinner parties. She was CL Hatch, the anonymous strategist who'd influenced boardroom decisions across 3 continents, who'd toppled rivals with a keystroke, who'd built a hidden empire while everyone believed she couldn't balance a checkbook. And her stupidity wasn't a condition. It was armor. To drop the mask would expose her to the marriage trap she'd spent 10 years evading. To show intelligence meant becoming currency in her father's desperate schemes. To be seen meant losing the only freedom she'd ever known, the freedom that came from being underestimated. So perhaps this is not a love story at all, but something darker, sharper, more calculated, a tale of predators and prey, of masks and mirrors, of a woman who learned that the best way to survive powerful men was to convince them she wasn't worth conquering. Or perhaps it is simply the story of a girl who played fool so long she forgot what it felt like to be seen, until a billionaire with eyes like scalpels started cutting through her carefully constructed lies. For how could a man who trusted nothing ever believe a woman who'd built her entire existence on deception? How could he see the truth when she'd spent 10 years perfecting the lie? How could Brian Dames ever recognize what she'd been hiding right before him all along? That the girl everyone dismissed as simple was the same mind he'd been chasing in boardrooms for years? The gala shimmered with ambition dressed as elegance. Chandeliers rained fractured light across marble floors where power brokers pretended their handshakes weren't weapons. Carolyn Hatcher stood at the room's edge, champagne glass trembling slightly in her grip, a detail she'd practiced until it looked natural. She let her gaze drift past conversations she understood perfectly, her expression calibrated to suggest she was lost in thoughts too simple to follow the rapid-fire business talk surrounding her. A senator misquoted Cicero to her left. Her jaw tightened imperceptibly before she forced it slack again. Let it go. Let him be wrong. That's not your fight anymore. 10 years of playing invisible had taught her patience. 10 years of biting back corrections, of watching men fail upward while she pretended not to notice, of building a secret empire from a laptop in her locked bedroom while the world believed she barely understood email. Music swelled from the orchestra, something classical she could name but wouldn't. Her father, Charles Hatcher, worked the room with desperate charm, his smile too wide, his laugh too loud. He was drowning in debt he thought she didn't understand, making promises to investors who were beginning to realize his empire was smoke and mirrors. Caroline felt the familiar burn of rage beneath her ribs, the price of silence, of swallowing truth after truth until your chest felt like a furnace. She endured it without flinching, maintaining the vacant smile that had protected her since she was 12 years old. This is for your freedom, she thought, watching her father clasp hands with a banking executive. For the life they can't control if they think you're too stupid to have one. And this for survival, she added silently, as a corporate wife patted her arm sympathetically and said, "Don't worry, dear. Not everyone needs to understand these complicated things." When the burning threatened to crack her composure, Carolyn closed her eyes briefly, remembering. Remembering the girl she'd been before. Voracious reader, debate champion, the daughter who'd once made her father proud before he'd decided her intelligence was a liability in marriage negotiations. That girl had built C.L. Hatch from nothing, had quietly accumulated influence while playing the fool at family dinners. Just 6 more months, she told herself. 6 more months until she turned 25 and accessed her mother's trust fund. 6 more months until she could drop the mask and disappear before her father could sell her off to save his sinking company. 6 months of pretending, of secret consulting work, of holding her tongue while freedom waited on the other side of silence. A shift in the room's energy made her breath catch. Carolyn froze, champagne glass halfway to her lips. She didn't need to turn to know who had just entered. The conversations didn't stop exactly, but they changed pitch, became more performative, as if everyone suddenly remembered they had an audience worth impressing. Footsteps approached, unhurried, confident, not the eager pace of men seeking favor, but the stride of someone who'd built his fortune on seeing through exactly the kind of performance she'd spent a decade perfecting. The footsteps of a man who missed nothing. Carolyn should leave. Any woman with sense would retreat to the powder room, avoid his attention, maintain the safe distance between predator and prey. But as a figure materialized at her elbow and a voice, low, measured, dangerous, said, "You dropped your program, Miss Hatcher." She felt the world tilt. She turned slowly, rehearsing her vacant smile. Brian Dames stood closer than protocol allowed, his gray eyes holding something that wasn't pity or dismissal. It was interest, sharp, surgical, the look of a man who'd just spotted an equation that didn't balance. He extended the program she hadn't realized she'd dropped, but his gaze wasn't on the paper. It was on her face, watching with the patience of someone who'd learned that the truth revealed itself in the space between words. "Thank you," she managed, voice soft and slightly uncertain. The voice of a woman who needed protection, not the voice of the strategist who'd written the market analysis his company had paid 6 figures for last month. "You're welcome." He didn't move. "Tell me something, Miss Hatcher." Her pulse hammered. "Stay in character. You've done this 1,000 times." "Yes, Mr. Dames?" His smile was subtle, knowing. How does a woman who can't remember her own father's speech quote Cicero under her breath when a senator gets it wrong? The champagne glass trembled in her grip, this time without any acting at all. For the first time in years, someone had caught her slipping. And the most dangerous part wasn't that he'd noticed. It was the way he was looking at her now, not with triumph or accusation, but with something infinitely more terrifying. Fascination. Caroline didn't sleep that night. She lay in her childhood bedroom, pink wallpaper chosen by a mother who died before teaching her daughter that survival required more than beauty, and replayed the moment over and over. How does a woman who can't remember her own father's speech quote Cicero under her breath? She'd recovered, barely, had blinked at Brian with wide, confused eyes and said, "I'm sorry, I don't understand. Was I supposed to be listening?" The smile she'd given him was the same one that had protected her for 10 years, empty, harmless, forgettable. But he hadn't looked convinced. He'd looked intrigued. At 6 a.m., her phone buzzed with news alerts. She grabbed it, still in bed, and felt her stomach drop. Dames Enterprises in talks with Hatcher Holdings. Merger could reshape tech sector. Billionaire Brian Dames eyes partnership with struggling dynasty. Sources say deal includes personal provisions. Personal provisions. Carolyn's fingers tightened on the phone. She knew exactly what that meant in her father's vocabulary. She'd been 12 years old the first time she'd overheard him on the phone with a potential investor. My daughter? Pretty enough, I suppose. Could sweeten any deal if the price is right. That was the day she'd started playing stupid. By 8 a.m., reporters' theaters had found the estate. Carolyn watched from her window as news vans lined the circular driveway, cameras aimed at the house like weapons. Her father stood on the front steps, all manufactured charm and careful deflection, answering questions she couldn't quite hear. She appeared beside him eventually because refusing would raise suspicions, wearing a pastel sundress and a confused smile. Miss Hatcher, what do you think about the potential merger? Carolyn blinked slowly as if translating the question from a foreign language. Oh, I think mergers are when companies come together. Papa says it's good for business. She looked at her father uncertainly. Is that right? Charles's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he recovered. My daughter doesn't trouble herself with corporate matters. She has other qualities. The reporters exchanged glances, some pitying, others amused. Caroline had seen those looks her entire adult life. They didn't hurt anymore. They were proof the disguise worked. Brian Dames arrived at 2 o'clock, precisely when he'd said he would. Carolyn watched from the upstairs landing as her father greeted him in the foyer. Brian's suit was charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, his movements economical. When he shook her father's hand, it wasn't the desperate grip of a man seeking favor. It was the controlled pressure of someone who already held all the cards and was simply deciding when to play them. Mr. Dames, her father said, too jovial. Welcome to our home. Thank you for receiving me, Charles. First names already, an intimacy her father hadn't earned. I thought we could discuss the finer details over dinner. Of course, of course. Charles gestured toward the dining room and then seemed to remember. My daughter will be joining us. Carolyn? She descended the stairs slowly, carefully, one hand trailing the banister like she needed it for balance. When she reached the foyer, she offered a small curtsy, the kind of old-fashioned gesture that made her seem like a relic from another era, quaint and unthreatening. Mr. Dames, she said softly. He took her hand, not shaking it, but holding it briefly, his thumb brushing her knuckles. Miss Hatcher, a pleasure to see you again. Your charming simplicity at last night's gala was quite refreshing, he continued, his gray eyes holding hers. So few people know how to simply be anymore. Everyone's performing. The irony hung in the air between them like smoke. Oh, Carolyn said, lowering her eyes. That's very kind. As she turned toward the dining room, her reflection caught in the glass door, and for just a fraction of a second, too quick for her father to see, but perfectly timed for Brian's line of sight, her expression shifted. The vacant smile transformed into something sharp, knowing. A smirk that said, I see exactly what you're doing, and you see me too, don't you? When she glanced back, Brian's expression hadn't changed, but something flickered in his eyes that sent electricity down her spine. Recognition. Dinner was a battlefield disguised as hospitality. Her father dominated conversation with desperate enthusiasm, pitching synergies and market opportunities, while Brian listened with the patience of a predator watching prey exhaust itself. Caroline picked at her salmon, head slightly tilted, expression suggesting she was mentally somewhere very far away. Then Brian shifted his attention to her. Miss Hatcher, your father mentioned you studied abroad briefly. Where was it again? Oh, she set down her fork carefully. I think it was France. Or maybe Italy. I don't remember much, honestly. I wasn't very good at the language part. Pity. He cut his steak with surgical precision. I find that understanding lingua franca in business, the common language of markets, is essential, though I suppose not everyone has the aptitude. Her father jumped in. Caroline's strengths lie elsewhere. The Ricardian model of comparative advantage, Brian continued, not looking at Charles, suggests that even entities with absolute disadvantages in all areas can still find profitable niches through specialization. He paused. Though, of course, the model assumes rational actors. When you introduce behavioral economics, bounded rationality, cognitive biases, the whole framework becomes messier. Carolyn felt the trap. He was testing whether she'd engage with concepts that someone of her supposed intelligence couldn't possibly follow. She started to nod vaguely, then he deliberately misquoted. As Keynes said, the market can remain solvent longer than you can remain irrational. Her fork paused halfway to her mouth. Irrational, she murmured, so softly her father didn't catch it. Brian did. I'm sorry? She looked up, realizing her mistake, but the words were already out. The market can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent. That's, that's the actual quote. Silence fell like a guillotine blade. Charles stared at his daughter. Brian leaned back in his chair, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. You're absolutely right, Brian said quietly. How careless of me. You're full of surprises, Miss Hatcher. Caroline's heart hammered. She forced her expression back to confusion. Did I say something wrong? Papa always says I mix up words. But the damage was done. Brian had gotten exactly what he wanted. Confirmation that underneath the mask, someone very different was watching, listening, thinking. At midnight, Caroline locked her bedroom door and opened her laptop. The screen glowed in the darkness as she logged into the encrypted portal. C.L. Hatch Consulting read the discreet header. Her secret life, her real life, the empire she'd built one analysis at a time while the world believed she couldn't balance a checkbook. 3 new requests waited in her queue. She scanned them quickly. A pharmaceutical merger assessment, a tech startup valuation, and her breath caught a competitive analysis for an anonymous client in the technology sector. The target company, Dames Enterprises. Carolyn stared at the screen. She'd written dozens of these reports, never knowing who'd commissioned them, never caring. That was the beauty of anonymity. But now, she should decline, should recognize the dangerous game she was playing. Instead, her fingers moved across the keyboard. Because C.L. Hatch never turned down work. And more importantly, because some reckless part of her wanted to prove, even if he'd never know it was her, that she could dissect his empire with the same precision he was using to dismantle her disguise. She pulled up Dames Enterprises' quarterly reports, cross-referenced SEC filings, analyzed market position and competitive vulnerabilities. The work consumed her, the way it always did when she stopped pretending and let her mind move at full speed. By 3 a.m., she'd completed a 15-page analysis that outlined exactly where Brian's company was vulnerable, which competitors were positioning to strike, and what strategic moves he should make in the next 6 months. She encrypted it, uploaded it to the secure server, and sat back. Somewhere in the city, a notification would ping on someone's phone. They'd read her work, never knowing it came from the simple girl who'd fumbled with champagne glasses the night before. Never knowing that Caroline Hatcher had just written Brian Dames a roadmap to his own blind spots, and in doing so had given him another piece of the puzzle he was so carefully assembling. The puzzle that, when complete, would show him exactly who she really was. Caroline closed her laptop and finally let herself smile. Not the vacant one she showed the world, but the sharp, dangerous one that belonged to C.L. Hatch. Let him test her. Let him lay his traps. She'd been playing this game alone for 10 years. But for the first time, she was playing against someone who might actually be worth the risk of losing. Brian Dames didn't believe in coincidences. Over the next 2 weeks, he compiled evidence like a prosecuting attorney building a case. His team had been chasing C.L. Hatch for 3 years, the anonymous consultant whose analyses had an uncanny accuracy rate that bordered on prophetic. Whoever this person was, they understood market psychology, regulatory loopholes, and corporate warfare with a precision that suggested either decades of experience or a mind that worked several moves ahead of everyone else. The reports were pristine. No identifying metadata, routed through VPNs that bounced across 4 continents. Payments accepted only in cryptocurrency to untraceable accounts. Whoever C.L. Hatch was, they'd thought of everything. Almost everything. Brian spread the documents across his desk. 15 analyses spanning 2 years, each one a masterpiece of strategic thinking. He'd paid for 3 of them himself. His competitors had paid for others. And now, staring at the pros, he saw patterns emerging like constellations. The writing was elegant, almost literary, not the dry corporate speak most consultants hid behind, but something sharper. Every report opened with a historical reference. Marcus Aurelius on one, Sun Tzu on another. The third sentence of every executive summary contained a subtle rhetorical device, a mirror structure that made the argument feel inevitable. And in the margins, barely visible unless you knew to look, line numbers, always grouped in sets that corresponded to Latin poetry. Horace mostly, sometimes Ovid. Brian leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. The same mind that wrote these reports was the same mind that had corrected his Keynes misquote at dinner. The same mind that tracked power dynamics at galas while pretending to be lost in simpler thoughts. Carolyn Hatcher wasn't simple. She was disciplined. And discipline like that required a reason. He began setting traps. At a gallery opening, he mentioned Machiavelli while standing beside her, deliberately mangling a famous passage. Her eye twitched, but she said nothing, just smiled vaguely and asked where the restrooms were. At a business lunch with her father present, he referenced the wrong author for a quote about game theory. Carolyn's fingers drummed once on the table, a micro-expression of frustration, before she caught herself and returned to her characteristic stillness. She was good, better than good. She'd had 10 years to perfect this, but everyone slipped eventually. The charity auction took place at the Rothmore Hotel, all marble columns and old money. Caroline wore cream silk, her hair loose, playing the decorative daughter role to perfection. She clapped politely when items sold, leaned over to ask her father whispered questions that made him pat her hand indulgently. Brian watched from across the room, patient as a spider. When the antique chess set came up for auction, 18th century, carved from ivory and ebony, he waited until the bidding reached 20,000 before raising his paddle. 30,000, he called out. Caroline glanced over, mildly curious. 35, countered a collector from Boston. 50, Brian said, not taking his eyes off Caroline. The room murmured. The auctioneer's gavel hovered. 50,000 going once. It's a beautiful set, Brian said, loud enough to carry, perfect for demonstrating classic strategies. The Fool's Gambit, for instance. Carolyn's champagne flute paused halfway to her lips. There is no Fool's Gambit, she said. The words came out reflexive. Automatic. The room went silent. Brian smiled slowly. I'm sorry? Color drained from her face as she realized what she'd done. But the damage was irreversible. You mean the Queen's sacrifice, she finished quietly. That's the actual name. When you sacrifice the Queen to, she trailed off, but it was too late. Every eye in the room had turned to the girl who supposedly couldn't follow dinner conversation, who just corrected a billionaire on chess strategy terminology that even most players wouldn't know. Her father's face had gone purple. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Brian's expression didn't change. He simply tilted his head slightly and said, voice soft with something that might have been admiration. Ah, so the Queen does move when cornered. Their eyes locked across the auction room. Predator and prey, hunter and hunted, though which had suddenly become very unclear. Sold! The auctioneer's gavel cracked. 50,000 to Mr. Dames. Carolyn didn't remember the drive home. She walked straight to her room, closed the door with deliberate calm, and then drove her fist into her pillow hard enough to make her knuckles ache. Stupid, stupid, stupid. 10 years. 10 years of perfect performance. And she'd blown it over a chess set because Brian Dames had deliberately used the wrong terminology, and her competitive instinct had overridden a decade of survival training. She paced her room, mind racing. He knew. Or if he didn't know everything, he knew enough to keep digging. And once he started connecting dots, the chess knowledge, the Keynes quote, the way she tracked conversations she pretended not to follow, it would only be a matter of time before he unraveled everything. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. The Queen always had power. She just convinced everyone she didn't. Carolyn stared at the screen. No signature, but she didn't need one. She should be terrified. Should be planning her exit strategy, preparing to abandon CL Hatch and disappear before Brian exposed her. Instead, she felt something far more dangerous. Excitement. Because for the first time in 10 years, someone was playing at her level. And the one man who saw her truth was the only man she absolutely could not afford to trust. But God, it felt good to be seen. The meeting happened 3 nights later in her father's study. Carolyn wasn't invited, which meant she positioned herself in the hallway outside, pressed against the wall in darkness, listening. "Brandy?" her father offered. The clink of crystal, the glug of expensive liquor. "Thank you." "Brian, I'll be direct. Hatcher Holdings needs this merger. My investors are getting nervous. The board is pushing for restructuring. And frankly," Charles's voice dropped, "I need this deal to work. I understand. The terms we discussed are generous. You'd acquire 49%, maintain operational control, and we'd provide," he paused, "strategic assets to sweeten the arrangement." Carolyn's hands curled into fists. She knew what came next. "My daughter," Charles continued. "Caroline, I know she's not what you'd typically consider, but she's beautiful, obedient, and from good stock. The marriage would cement the merger, satisfy some of my more traditional investors, and remove the liability of an unmarriageable daughter," Brian finished. "You understand business." Silence. Caroline held her breath. Then, "A merger on all fronts, then?" Her father laughed, relieved, triumphant. "Excellent. I'll have my lawyers draw up." "I have conditions," Brian interrupted. "The wedding happens within 6 months. And I want full access to Hatcher Holdings' financial records. Complete transparency." A pause. "That's highly irregular." "Those are my terms." Another pause. Longer this time. Carolyn could picture her father's face, calculating risk against reward, pride against desperation. "Agreed," Charles said finally. The sound of a handshake. Carolyn pressed her palm against her mouth to keep from making a sound. Rage. Fear. Something that tasted like betrayal but shouldn't, because she'd always known her father would do this eventually. She just hoped she'd have escaped first. After Brian left, Carolyn waited until her father's study went dark, then crept to his office. She'd learned to pick the lock years ago, learned where he kept his passwords written on the underside of his desk drawer, learned to cover her digital tracks. The financial servers opened like a book she'd read before. Except this time, the numbers made her stomach turn. Offshore accounts in the Caymans, shell corporations funneling money through 3 layers of holding companies, falsified revenue reports, inflated asset valuations, quarterly statements that bore no resemblance to actual cash flow. Her father wasn't just struggling, he was drowning. And he'd been lying about it for at least 3 years. Caroline downloaded everything to an encrypted drive, her hands shaking. If this went public, it wouldn't just destroy her father. It would destroy everyone associated with Hatcher Holdings, including her, if she wasn't careful. Her phone rang at 7 a.m., jolting her from 2 hours of restless sleep. "Miss Hatcher," Brian's voice crisp and entirely too awake. "Good morning." Carolyn scrambled to assemble her mask, her voice. "Mr. Dames, hello. I wanted to discuss our arrangement. Your father and I came to terms last night." "Oh." She injected confusion into her tone. "I'm not sure I understand what that means." "It means you and I are getting married." Silence. Then, "Married? But we barely know each other." "We'll remedy that." His tone was unreadable. "You're awfully quiet this morning, Miss Hatcher. Planning something?" The question was a blade wrapped in velvet. Caroline forced a giggle, the same empty sound she'd used 1,000 times before. "I'm just slow to process numbers and arrangements, and—" She trailed off helplessly. "Everything, really." "Good," Brian said, and there was something in his voice that made her blood run cold and hot simultaneously. "Because I never am." The line went dead. Carolyn sat on her bed, phone clutched in her hand, and felt the walls closing in. Her father had sold her. Brian was playing a game she didn't fully understand. And somewhere in the middle of it all, she had to figure out how to survive with her secrets intact. She pulled up her laptop, logged into CL Hatch's portal, and began drafting a new analysis. If Brian wanted to marry her, fine. If her father wanted to use her as a bargaining chip, fine, but she'd be damned if she went down without understanding exactly what game they were all playing, and she'd be even more damned if she didn't win. The summons came via text, my office, 7 p.m. Come alone. Carolyn stood in the lobby of Dame's Tower at 6:55, wearing armor disguised as a sundress, her hair pulled back in a style that suggested innocence, while her mind calculated exit strategies. The elevator ride to the penthouse suite took 47 seconds. She counted each one. Brian's office was glass and steel. The city spread below like a circuit board of lights. He stood at the window, hands in his pockets, not turning when she entered. "Miss Hatcher," still facing the window, "thank you for coming. You asked me to." She kept her voice soft, uncertain. "I did." He turned finally, and the expression on his face made her breath catch. "Because we need to have an honest conversation. And I find that honesty is easier when there are no audiences." He crossed to his desk and dropped a file on the polished surface. It landed with a sound like a gunshot. "I've read your work," he said quietly. Carolyn's heart stopped. "I don't." C.L. Hatch. He opened the file, revealing printed reports, her reports, covered in his annotations. "You've been running a silent empire behind your father's back. And mine." Her carefully constructed mask cracked. She said nothing, trapped between denial and confession. Brian pulled out a single page, pointed to the bottom margin. "You sign your work. Not obviously, but you do. Line numbers corresponding to Latin poetry. Horace, mostly. Dum loquimur fugarit invida aetas. While we speak, envious time flees. You use that same reference in a conversation at the gallery opening. You corrected my chess terminology at the auction, and you quoted Keynes perfectly at dinner." He looked up. "You're C.L. Hatch, the consultant I've been paying 6 figures for strategic analysis. The mind that's been influencing boardroom decisions across 3 continents." Silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut. Finally, Caroline spoke. "You wouldn't understand. Try me. I had to play stupid to survive." The words came out raw, angry. "Do you know what happens to intelligent women in my father's world? We become assets, tools. We get married off to men who want decorative wives and strategic alliances. So I made myself worthless. I made myself so simple, so empty, that no one wanted me." She laughed bitterly. "And it worked. Until you." Brian studied her, not with triumph or judgment, but with something far more dangerous. Respect. "You played the world like a chessboard," he said slowly. "Every move calculated, every sacrifice strategic. I'm not sure whether to be impressed or terrified." "Both would be smart," he almost smiled. "How long?" 10 years, since I was 12. And your father has no idea." "My father sees what he wants to see, a disappointment he can offload to the highest bidder." Brian was quiet for a long moment. Then he moved to the window, beckoning her to join him. The city glittered below, beautiful, ruthless, unforgiving. "Your father's numbers don't add up," he said quietly. "I had my forensic accountants look at what he provided for due diligence. It's fiction. Shell companies, inflated assets, revenue that exists only on paper." He turned to her. "You already know this, don't you?" She didn't answer, didn't need to. "When the storm hits," Brian continued, voice low, "and it will hit, auditors are already circling. You're going to have to choose your side, his legacy or your future." Caroline's reflection stared back at her from the glass, a woman she barely recognized, caught between 2 identities, 2 lives, 2 impossibilities. "Why are you telling me this?" she whispered. "Because," Brian said, and there was something almost gentle in his voice. "I've spent 3 years trying to understand C.L. Hatch's brilliance. And now that I've met her, I don't want to watch her go down with a sinking ship and because of misplaced loyalty." He pulled out his phone, typed something, then showed her the screen, a message draft addressed to her. "Your father's numbers don't add up. When the storm hits, choose your side wisely. I'm sending this tomorrow morning," he said, "so that when you're asked later, you can say you had no prior knowledge of my investigation, that you learned about his fraud the same time I did." Carolyn looked at him, really looked, past the billionaire armor to the man underneath. "Why are you protecting me?" "Because," Brian said, "for the first time in my life, I've met someone who plays the game as well as I do, and I'd rather have you as an ally than watch you become collateral damage." He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat of him, see the calculation behind his eyes. "The marriage contract stands," he said, "but not for the reasons your father thinks. I need access to Hatcher Holdings to expose the fraud, and you need protection from the fallout. We help each other." A business arrangement. Exactly. Carolyn should walk away, should recognize this is another trap, another man trying to control her. But something in Brian's eyes told her this was different. He saw her, really saw her, and instead of using it against her, he was offering a partnership. "What do you get out of this?" she asked. His smile was sharp, dangerous. The satisfaction of taking down a corrupt empire and a wife who can quote Cicero. Despite everything, the fear, the anger, the 10 years of hiding, Caroline laughed, real laughter, not the empty kind she'd perfected. "Checkmate," she said softly. "Not yet." Brian extended his hand. "But we're getting there." She took it. His grip was firm, equal, the handshake of allies entering battle. And as the city glittered below them, two predators circled each other, wondering if partnership might be more dangerous than warfare, and infinitely more interesting. The study door slammed open at 2 a.m. Caroline jolted awake in her bedroom, laptop still warm on the covers beside her. She'd fallen asleep reviewing her father's financial files, building the case piece by piece, preparing for the moment when everything would come crashing down. She just hadn't expected it to crash down on her. "Get in here!" Charles's voice carried down the hallway, not his public voice, polished and charming, but the one he used when business deals fell through and scapegoats needed to be found. Caroline pulled on a robe and walked to his study on legs that already knew this wouldn't end well. Her father stood behind his desk, her laptop, her personal laptop, the one with encrypted files, open in front of him. "How did you—" she started. "I own this house." He slammed his palm on the desk. "I pay for the internet, the electricity, every goddamn thing you touch. Did you really think I wouldn't monitor your activity?" Her blood ran cold. "Bahektin, you've been watching me for 6 months, ever since that bastard dame started sniffing around." Charles's face was purple with rage. "C.L. Hatch. My daughter, the simpleton, is C.L. Hatch. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I built something," Carolyn said quietly. "Without your name, without your money, something that was mine. You embarrassed me all these years playing the fool, making me look like I raised a defective." He caught himself. "And all along you were undermining me, advising my competitors, writing reports that cost me deals. I never wrote anything about Hatcher Holdings. No, you just conspired with Brian Dames to destroy me." He pulled out his phone, showed her screen captures, messages between her and Brian, except they weren't real. The timestamps were wrong, the phrasing wasn't hers. "That's fabricated," she said. "I never—" "Shut up!" Charles was scrolling through files now, his mind already 3 moves ahead. She recognized that look. She'd inherited it from him, the ability to see angles, calculate outcomes, weaponize information. And now he was weaponizing her. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "By morning, every media outlet in the city will know that my troubled daughter, who suffers from delusions, you understand, created a fake consulting persona to seduce Brian Dames. That you manipulated stock reports to make yourself seem valuable. That you fabricated your credentials to trap a billionaire into marriage. No one will believe. Everyone will believe it. Because I have proof." He tapped the laptop. "Screenshots of your conversations with Dames, financial records showing suspicious activity, expert testimony from psychiatrists who will confirm your history of mental instability." His smile was vicious. "I've been preparing this for weeks, Caroline. Ever since I realized you were the leak." She felt the floor tilt beneath her. "I'm not a leak. I never—" "You think Brian Dames actually wants you?" Charles laughed, bitter, cruel. "He's using you to get to me, to expose my business practices and take over Hatcher Holdings. And you, stupid girl, you fell for it. That's not— It doesn't matter what's true, it matters what I can prove." He closed the laptop with a decisive snap. By noon tomorrow, you'll be a cautionary tale, the social climber who faked intelligence to trap a rich man. And when the dust settles, dames will walk away clean. I'll restructure my debts as a victim of fraud. And you, he met her eyes, you'll be exactly what I always told people you were. Nothing. The story broke at 6 a.m. Caroline watched from her apartment. She'd fled the estate before sunrise, as her name scrolled across every news channel. Hatcher Harris exposed, elaborate deception to trap billionaire. C.L. Hatch revealed as mentally unstable woman with history of delusions. Sources, Caroline Hatcher fabricated credentials, manipulated markets. Her phone exploded with calls. Reporters found her address within an hour. By 7 a.m., news vans lined the street outside her building. She pulled the curtains closed and sat in the shadows of her living room, watching her life dissolve on screen after screen. Someone had leaked photos, her at galas, playing the simpleton, her college transcripts, annotated with notes suggesting academic dishonesty. Even her medical records, showing therapy sessions from when she was 12, now reframed as evidence of long-term psychological issues. They'd taken every true thing about her and twisted it into a weapon. Her phone buzzed. Brian's name flashed on the screen. Finally, she answered, hands shaking. "Brian?" The line went dead. She called back, straight to voicemail, called again, same thing. The message was clear. He'd cut her off. Whatever alliance they'd formed, whatever understanding they'd reached in his penthouse overlooking the city, it was gone. He'd protected himself and left her to burn. At 10 a.m., her father appeared on television, standing outside Hatcher Holdings, looking appropriately devastated. "My daughter's illness has always been difficult," he said, voice heavy with manufactured sorrow. "But I never realized how deep her delusions ran. She's a smart girl, too smart, perhaps. She learned to manipulate people, to create elaborate fantasies." He paused as if gathering strength. "I blame myself. I should have gotten her more help. Instead, I indulged her, and now," he gestured helplessly at the crowd of reporters, "now she's hurt not just herself, but an innocent man who showed her kindness." Carolyn watched the screen through tears, but they weren't the tears Charles wanted the world to see. She wasn't crying because she'd been exposed. She was crying because the mask she'd built to survive, the disguise that had protected her for 10 years, had been turned into a prison she couldn't escape. Her father had done what she'd always feared someone would do. He'd used her intelligence against her, made her brilliance look like manipulation, turned her survival strategy into proof of insanity. And the cruelest part was that he'd done it using the exact skills she'd inherited from him. By noon, she'd stopped answering the door, stopped checking her phone, stopped watching the news cycle devour everything she'd built. She sat in the darkness and wondered if there was a point in fighting when the entire world had already decided who she was. Carolyn disappeared on a Tuesday night. She left her apartment through the service entrance, wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses, carrying nothing but a worn suitcase and a laptop bag. The reporters out front didn't notice the ordinary-looking woman slipping past them toward the subway. The world assumed she'd fled in shame. Let them think it. In truth, she'd gone to war. She checked into a motel 40 miles outside the city, paid cash, used a fake name. For 3 days, she barely slept. She compiled evidence the way C.L. Hatch would, methodically, ruthlessly, building an unassailable case. Her father's offshore accounts, traced through 3 layers of shell corporations. The falsified audits she'd found weeks ago, now cross-referenced with actual bank statements showing the real numbers. Emails from her father to his accountant discussing creative bookkeeping. Wire transfers to government officials that looked suspiciously like bribes. The puzzle completed itself like one final chess match she refused to lose. Every transaction, every lie, every falsified document, she compiled it all into a single encrypted file and backed it up in 3 separate locations. If she was going down, she wasn't going down alone. On the 4th night, her burner phone rang, a number she didn't recognize. "Miss Hatcher?" A man's voice, nervous. "My name is Robert Chen. I was your father's accountant." Carolyn's hand tightened on the phone. "I'm listening." "I need to meet with you. There's something you need to know about the evidence against you." They met at a diner off the highway. The kind of place where no one looked twice at strangers. Chen was in his 50s, wearing a suit that had seen better days, his hands shaking as he stirred coffee. He didn't drink. I fabricated those screenshots, he said without preamble. The messages between you and Mr. Dames. Your father threatened to expose my own indiscretions if I didn't cooperate. I'm sorry, I should have refused, but I have a family, and I need you to testify, Carolyn interrupted. I can't. He'll destroy me. He's going to destroy you anyway. She leaned forward. Charles Hatcher doesn't leave loose ends. Whatever he has on you, he'll use it eventually. Your only protection is to expose him first. Chen looked at her, really looked, and Carolyn saw the moment he recognized her, not as the delusional girl from the news, but as someone who understood the game because she'd been playing it longer than anyone realized. Mr. Dames is looking for you, Chen said finally. He came to me 3 days ago, asked me about the evidence. I think he knows. Meanwhile, across the city, Brian Dames sat in his office reviewing financial documents that made Charles Hatcher's fabrications look like amateur hour. He'd known something was wrong when the scandal broke. The screenshots had been too perfect, the timing too convenient. But what confirmed it was a single detail only he would notice. In one of the fabricated messages, Caroline had used a phrase C.L. Hatch never would have, a grammatical construction that betrayed a different author. Charles had been sloppy or desperate. Brian had spent the last 4 days tracking down the truth, calling in favors, threatening auditors, following money trails that led back to Hatcher Holdings like all roads to Rome. And now, with Chen's testimony and Caroline's encrypted files that his forensic team had recovered from cloud backups, he had everything he needed. Not for business, for justice. His phone buzzed with a location ping from the investigator he'd hired to find Carolyn. A bus terminal, 80 miles north. Brian grabbed his coat and was out the door in 30 seconds. She was sitting on a bench near Gate 7, suitcase at her feet, wearing jeans and a sweatshirt that made her look younger, more vulnerable than the woman who'd quoted Cicero at galas. Brian sat down beside her without asking permission. Running away? He asked quietly. Caroline didn't look at him. Regrouping. With a one-way ticket to where? Portland? Seattle? Somewhere you think Charles won't find you? Somewhere I can start over. You think I'd let you disappear before you win? That made her turn. Her eyes were red-rimmed but fierce, the mask finally gone completely. You didn't call. For 4 days you didn't call. The line went dead and I thought, you thought I believed him. Brian's voice was gentle. Carolyn, I've been investigating your father since the moment that story broke. I knew it was fabricated within an hour. The syntax was wrong, the timestamps didn't match your actual communication patterns, and he smiled faintly. You'd never be stupid enough to leave that kind of trail. She stared at him. You knew. I knew. He pulled out a folder, thick with documents. And now I have proof. Chen's testimony, forensic analysis of the fabrications, evidence of Charles's actual crimes going back 5 years, everything. Why didn't you tell me? Because I needed you angry, needed you to do what you do best, compile your own case, build your own arsenal. And because, he looked at her directly, you needed to know that you could survive without me, that you're not the damsel in this story. You're the queen making the sacrifice play. Tears slid down her cheeks, but she was smiling. I'm tired of pretending. Then stop. Brian stood, offering his hand. The board meeting is tomorrow morning. Charles thinks he's won. He's planning a restructuring announcement, a public apology for his daughter's behavior, a whole performance about being a victim. And we're going to destroy him. No, Brian pulled her to her feet. We're going to let him destroy himself. You and I are just going to provide the evidence. The world's about to meet the real Caroline Hatcher. And trust me, his smile was sharp, dangerous, proud. They're going to be terrified. She looked at him. This man who'd seen through her disguise, who'd given her partnership instead of pity, who'd waited for her to choose herself before offering to stand beside her. Let's go win, she said. And for the first time in 10 years, Caroline Hatcher walked forward without a mask, ready to show the world exactly who she'd been all along. The Grand Metropolitan Ballroom was packed with journalists, investors, and board members who'd gathered for what was supposed to be Charles Hatcher's redemption tour. Carolyn stood in the wings, watching her father take the podium. He wore his best suit, his most sincere expression. The mask of a man wronged by circumstance rather than choice. Behind him, screens displayed the Hatcher Holdings logo, gleaming and dignified. "Thank you all for coming," Charles began, voice heavy with manufactured emotion. "I want to address the recent scandal involving my daughter, Carolyn. As many of you know, she's struggled with difficulties for years, mental health challenges that I, as her father, perhaps didn't take seriously enough." Carolyn's hands clenched. Beside her, Brian checked his watch. 30 seconds, he murmured. "I enabled her delusions," Charles continued, "allowed her to create this false identity, this C.L. Hatch persona, because I thought it was harmless. A way for her to feel valuable when reality was—" He paused as if the words pained him. "When reality was difficult for her to process." 20 seconds. "But when she began manipulating markets, fabricating credentials to seduce Mr. Brian Dames into a merger designed to destroy Hatcher Holdings," Charles's voice cracked perfectly. "I knew I had to act, for her sake, for the sake of everyone she might harm." 10 seconds. Carolyn took a breath, straightened her spine, dropped every mask she'd worn for a decade. "Now," Brian said. They walked out together, hand in hand, onto the stage beside Charles. The room erupted, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions, board members rising from their seats in confusion. Charles's face drained of color. "What are you—" "Thank you, Charles, for that fascinating performance," Brian said, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "But I think it's time we corrected a few inaccuracies." He held up a file, thick, documented, damning. "Carolyn Hatcher isn't delusional. She's brilliant. C.L. Hatch isn't a fabrication. It's a consulting empire she built while you were busy underestimating her. And the only manipulation that occurred was yours." "This is absurd." Charles started toward them, but two men in dark suits materialized from the wings. Federal agents, Caroline realized. Brian had planned every detail. "Miss Hatcher didn't deceive the world," Brian continued, his hand tightening on Carolyn's. "She deceived the predators who built it, the men who see intelligent women as threats to be neutralized rather than minds to be respected. She survived the only way she could, by making herself invisible." He began distributing documents to the front row of reporters. "What you're receiving now is evidence of systematic fraud at Hatcher Holdings spanning 5 years. Falsified audits, offshore accounts containing embezzled funds, wire transfers to government officials that violate the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, shell corporations designed to hide money laundering." He paused. "All orchestrated by Charles Hatcher." The room exploded. Cameras swung toward Charles, whose careful composure was cracking like ice under pressure. "You have no proof," he tried. "We have your accountant's testimony," Brian said calmly. "We have forensic analysis of your servers. We have email correspondence discussing creative bookkeeping and offshore solutions. And we have Caroline's own files, compiled meticulously, documented thoroughly, everything cross-referenced and verified." "She's lying. She fabricated the screenshots you released showing Caroline's supposed manipulation." Brian pulled out another document. "Forensic analysis proves they were created on your personal laptop 6 days before you leaked them to the press. The metadata doesn't lie, Charles. Unlike you." Sirens wailed outside. Through the ballroom windows, police cars became visible, lights flashing red and blue against the morning sun. "Charles Hatcher," one of the federal agents stepped forward, "you're under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit securities fraud. You have the right to remain silent." Carolyn watched her father's face cycle through emotions: rage, fear, disbelief, calculation. Even in handcuffs, she could see him trying to find the angle, the play, the way out. There wasn't one. As they led him past her toward the exit, Charles met her eyes. "You stupid girl," he hissed. "You had a good life. I gave you everything." "You gave me nothing," Carolyn said quietly, "except a reason to become someone you couldn't control." The agents pulled him away. The ballroom erupted in questions. cameras turning toward Caroline like flowers toward sun. She stood frozen under the lights, no mask, no disguise, no carefully calibrated expression. Just herself, terrified and exhilarated and more exposed than she'd ever been in her life. "Miss Hatcher!" A reporter thrust a microphone forward. "Is it true you're CL Hatch?" "Yes," she said. Her voice didn't shake. "How long have you been operating under that identity?" 10 years, since I was 15. "Why?" She looked at the cameras, at the faces watching her, and told the truth. "Because intelligent women in my father's world are assets to be traded. I chose to be worthless. It was the only way to be free." "And your relationship with Mr. Dames?" Brian stepped closer, his presence solid beside her. "Is none of your concern," he said pleasantly. "Next question." For 30 minutes they fielded questions, Brian handling the legal aspects, Caroline explaining C.L. Hatch's work without apology or shame. By the time they left the podium, the narrative had shifted entirely. She wasn't the delusional daughter anymore. She was the woman who'd outsmarted everyone. Later that evening in Brian's office overlooking the city, silence fell heavy between them. Carolyn stood at the window where she'd stood weeks ago when he'd confronted her about her identity. The city glittered below, the same lights, the same skyline. But everything else had changed. "You saw through me from the beginning," she said quietly, not turning. Brian moved to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "I didn't see through you," he replied. "I saw you, the version even you forgot existed." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "You spent so long pretending to be simple that you started believing your intelligence was something shameful, something that had to be hidden." His gray eyes held hers. "But brilliance isn't a flaw, Caroline. And you didn't deceive people by hiding yours. You survived people who would have weaponized it." Tears threatened, but she blinked them back. "I don't know how to be her anymore. The girl who didn't have to pretend." "Then learn." He turned to face her fully. "You built an empire in secret. Imagine what you could build in the open. Your board thinks I'm a liability. My board thinks a lot of stupid things. I don't listen to them." Despite everything, she laughed. "What happens now?" "Now, Brian's smile was slow, dangerous, warm. "Now you stop asking permission. You stop hiding. You stop measuring your worth by other people's expectations." He stepped closer. "And if you want, only if you want, we figure out what this is between us. Without your father's schemes, without merger talks, just you and me, seeing where it goes." "That terrifies me," she admitted. "Good. You're at your best when you're terrified and fighting anyway." She looked at him, this man who'd chased her through disguises, who'd seen her truth and responded with partnership instead of possession, who'd stood beside her when the world was ready to destroy her. "The marriage contract," she said, "is that still void? The merger's dead, your father's in custody, and you're free." He paused. "Unless you want to renegotiate." "Renegotiate?" "New terms, no business arrangements, no corporate alliances, just two people who happen to meet at a gala, who quote philosophers at each other, who play chess with empires." His voice softened. "Just us, Caroline, no masks." She thought about it, thought about running, about starting over somewhere new, about building C.L. Hatch into something bigger without the weight of her past. Then she thought about what she'd told herself for 10 years, that being underestimated was armor, that solitude was safety, that needing anyone was weakness. And she realized she didn't want to be that girl anymore. "Okay," she whispered, "okay? Okay, let's see where it goes." She smiled, real, unguarded hers. "But I'm keeping my own apartment and my own company. And if you ever try to protect me by making decisions without me, you'll destroy me," he finished. "I know. I'm counting on it." He kissed her then, soft and certain, and Caroline felt something in her chest unlock, the last piece of armor finally falling away. When they pulled apart, the city glittered below them, full of possibilities that no longer felt like threats. "Thank you," she said, "for seeing me when I'd forgotten how." "Thank you," Brian replied, "for being worth the search." 6 months later, Caroline Hatcher stood in a different ballroom, surveying a different crowd. The Hatch Initiative's launch event was smaller than the galas her father used to drag her to, more intimate, more purposeful. No peacocking executives or desperate social climbers. Just women who'd been where she'd been, trapped in systems that weaponized their intelligence, looking for a way out. The goal isn't to hide, Caroline said from the small stage addressing the room. It's to protect. We provide legal counsel, financial planning, and strategic consulting for women navigating hostile professional environments. We help you build power that no one can take away. The applause was genuine, warm. Headlines no longer mocked her, they celebrated her. From scandal to success, Caroline Hatcher's remarkable transformation. The Hatch Initiative, empowering women in corporate America. C.L. Hatch steps into the light. Brian watched from the back of the room, pride evident in his expression. He'd funded the initial investment, silent partner, as promised, but stayed out of operations entirely. This was hers. After the speeches, after the networking and champagne, after the last guest had left with new hope and business cards, Caroline found herself alone in the empty ballroom. Not quite alone. Brian approached, hands in his pockets, smile soft. Still quoting philosophers, Miss Hatcher? She turned, and the emerald dress she wore, the same shade as that first gala, but tailored to her specifications this time, chosen because she wanted it, not because it made her look harmless. Caught the light. Only when the company's worth it, she said. Then let's make it worth it. He extended his hand. She took it. And as they walked through the ballroom that no longer felt like a battlefield, beneath chandeliers that no longer hid her, Carolyn realized she'd won something more valuable than any corporate victory. She'd won herself back. The girl who'd spent 10 years pretending to be powerless had become a woman who no longer needed to pretend anything. The world had tried to make her small. She'd made herself invisible. And then, piece by piece, she'd built herself back into someone no one could ignore. Not because she was louder, not because she'd fought harder, but because she'd finally stopped apologizing for being exactly who she was. You know, Brian said as they reached the exit, I never did get an answer about that renegotiated contract. Carolyn stopped, looked up at him with eyes that no longer calculated escape routes or measured threat levels. Just looked at him as a woman looking at a man she'd somehow, impossibly, learned to trust. What are you proposing, Mr. Dames? Partnership, equal shares, combined assets, a merger of the most permanent kind. He smiled. Mirage, Caroline, the real kind. Not the corporate arrangement your father tried to broker, but the kind where two people choose each other because they're better together than apart. She should have been terrified, should have felt trapped, controlled, turned into currency again. Instead, she felt free. I'll need my own lawyers to review the terms, she said. I'd be disappointed if you didn't. And I'm keeping my company separate, no combining operations. Wouldn't dream of suggesting otherwise. And if you ever try to play the protective hero, you'll destroy me with the precision of someone who's been planning my downfall for years. Yes, I know. It's one of your more attractive qualities. Carolyn laughed, the real laugh, the one that came from somewhere deep and true. Then yes, let's do the most permanent merger. Yes? Yes, Brian, I'll marry you, not because I need you to save me, but because you're the only person who never tried. He kissed her under the ballroom exit lights, and somewhere in the city, the girl Caroline used to be, the one who'd learned to hide at 12 years old, who'd built empires in secret, who'd survived by making herself invisible, finally, beautifully, completely disappeared. In her place stood a woman who no longer played the fool, who no longer needed to pretend, who won not by hiding her truth, but by living it so fiercely the world had no choice but to see. And as they walked into the night together, two equals who'd found each other in the space between masks and truth, Carolyn Hatcher realized the greatest victory wasn't outsmarting her enemies. It was finally, after 10 years of pretending, learning to be herself, and discovering that herself was more than enough.